Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for having us here today. What an enlightening morning session we have had. These are challenging times, not least for this region, but with challenges, as we've discussed this morning, come opportunities, which is why our next panel, the race for relevance and influence in the region, couldn't be better timed. I'm Becky Anderson, the managing editor of CNN, based in Abu Dhabi, and the host of the eponymous Connect the World with Becky Anderson show nightly here across the region and the world. Over the next 50 minutes or so, we will take a deep dive into the dynamics between the main regional powers in the Middle East: Turkey, Iran, Russia, and the GCC. It's clear that each has its own vision and strategy for the future of this region, oft times, but not always, conflicting and divergent. And we will discuss whether these positions can be reconciled and the consequences for the region should they not be reconciled. To shed some light then on the signals that will likely shape the wider Middle East in this decade to come, I am delighted today to be joined by Karim Sajipour, who is the Iran expert and senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Karim will provide analysis on Iran's policy towards the region, the possible shakeout from the US maximum pressure campaign and sanctions, and in view of developments at home and around the region, thoughts on what the Islamic Republic might stand for in its fifth decade. Hussein Bakci is Professor and Chair of the International Relations Department at METU and Deputy Director of the Foreign Policy Institute in Ankara. The professor will provide insight into the relationship between Turkey and its neighbors, the worldwide view, if you will, of the Turkish president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and what role Turkey might play in stabilizing this region. Elena Suponina is advisor at the Russian Institute of Strategic Studies, and with Russia riding high in the region after its intervention in the Syrian civil war, I hope you will provide some analysis for us on Russia's strategy in the Middle East and its role and intentions in the future. And Dr. Abdulaziz bin Saga is the founder and chairman of the Gulf Research Center, a good friend, I know, of many of you here. For his part, he will review Saudi Arabia's short and long-term strategy and provide some perspective on whether or not there is, for example, any merit in Russia's initiative to establish security in the Gulf region. We have about 45, 46 minutes. I'm going to ask you all to provide us just some thoughts in 2 to 3 minutes. I'm pretty ruthless. I will cut you off if I think you're going over, because I do want this to be as lively as possible. And I do call on you. I know it's been a long morning session. There are some microphones doing the rounds. If you would like to ask some questions, please put your hand up. I'll start looking around the room in about 20, 25 minutes time. And if you've got some questions, please, this is your session. And as interactive a session as possible is always good. So without further ado then, Karim, let me give you the floor for 2 to 3 minutes just to pose what you believe is the perspective for Iran on this region as we stand and going forward.
Thank you, Becky. It's great to be here. One of the lessons all of us who've worked on the Middle East have learned is never to make predictions about the future. So let me talk very briefly about what I see are 4 trends, challenges over the next decade. Number 1 is what I see as Iran's transformation from the last 4 decades of being a clerical authoritarian regime to the next decade, I would argue, the transformation of Iran into more of a military autocracy, a government which is ruled more by revolutionary guardsmen than clerics. Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, is 80 years old. He's unlikely to be on the scene in 2030. And I think we will start to see in Iran the emergence of a Persian nationalism, which eclipses Shia nationalism, the organizing principle of Iran going from Shia revolutionary ideology to more Persian nationalism. And I would argue the emergence of an Iranian Putin, someone who is it's not going to transform into democracy, but an Iranian strongman who comes from the military rather than the seminary. Trend number 2 I see in the region is the evolution of identity among Arab Shia. Over the last two decades, the Shia part of Arab Shia identity has been stronger than the Arab or nationalistic part of their identity in the aftermath of the Iraq War. I think we already see signs that that is changing. In Iraq, there have been protests against Iran's consulate in Najaf and Karbala. We see the protests, the popular protests in Lebanon. There have been huge protests in places like Nabatea, traditionally Hezbollah strongholds. So I think over the next decade, we will continue to see the reemergence of Arab and a national identity among the Arab Shia. And here I think there's a very important role to be played by Sunni Arab powers like Saudi Arabia, like the UAE, to welcome Arab Shia under the fold and kind of lure them away from Iran. Challenge number 3 I see is the mental health challenge in the Middle East. We are living in a region with tens of millions of people who have post-traumatic stress disorder, predominantly Syrians and Yemenis, but many others. And the effects of this PTSD are going to be with us for decades to come, and they're going to have ancillary effects like radicalism. And I look at the remarkable role the United Arab Emirates has played in building world-class clinics in Dubai and Abu Dhabi. And I think it's time for a world-class mental health clinic to train thousands of counselors in the Arabic language who can treat this emerging challenge we will see among a region which has really been wrought by incredible violence and refugees. The very final thing I'll say is that I think over the next decade, we will see in some ways a reemergence of the United States. Not a reemergence of the United States militarily, but I think for all of the complaints and valid criticisms about America's role in the region, when you talk to leaderships throughout the region, they still would rather have strategic partnership with Washington than they would with Moscow or Beijing. They would still prefer to send their children to study in the United States than in Russia. And so I think in the next decade, the challenge for the United States will be figuring out how it can play a strong presence in the region, even if that is not a military presence. So I'll stop there and look forward to your questions.
Thank you for that. Excellent. Dr. Baji, the Turkish Interior Minister said last week, and I quote, "It is Turkey and this nation that will turn the Middle East into a land of peace." He said, going on to say, "We will achieve this all together through protecting brotherhood." How so, sir? Do you buy that? And lay out what you believe are the sort of 4 Turkish principles, short and long term, for the region.
I'm always very careful to buy what the politicians say, but from the academic perspective, I can tell you that Turkey is a global and regional player, and geopolitically and geoeconomically, Turkey will stay here in this geography. Doesn't matter who is running Turkey as prime minister or president in the long run. Therefore, there will be no neo-Ottoman policies anymore as before. Turkey is, like Iran, non-Arab country, but playing a very important strategic stability role in the area. At the end of the day, Turkey has more than 4 million Syrian refugees, and which is another important thing to make Turkish-European Union relations in another level. So Turkey will be also together with China in this one road, one belt policy, one of the key players soon, also in the future. The demand that Turkey will contribute for the peace and democracy in the Middle East is, of course, a wishful thinking. Of course, at the same time, it depends how the Arab countries and the regional countries will respond. The Turkish borders in the eastern part are burning. Iran is burning, Iraq is burning, Syria is already destroyed, Lebanon is having a lot of troubles. So Turkey cannot sit on the balcony and look how the neighboring countries' house burning. It is something that Turkey has to do. something. The problem is the Turkish President Erdogan is very much disappointed by the Arab Spring. Turkey is the loser of the Arab Spring. When you look Turkey's position before Arab Spring and after Arab Spring, you see two different Turkey. In the previous one, Turkey was the consciousness of the Middle East, bringing Israel, Syria, and many other countries together, not taking part in any conflict, no sectarian policies, by the way. But after Arab Spring, Turkey has chosen a wrong direction, I would say, more sectarian, more getting involved in the Arab conflicts in particular, which was considered in Turkey anyway wrong by many academics. But at the end of the day, Turkey is there, being a member of NATO, being strategic ally of the United States of America, negotiating with the European Union. So Turkey has pros and cons. So Turkey is not the rule maker in the Middle East, as Davutoğlu claimed. He said that nothing can happen in the Middle East without our consent. It is not anymore. It is en passe. The question is here, what type of Turkish politicians and what type of Turkish, I would say, economy, social structure will contribute or will become, again, if possible, a model for the Islamic countries. This model of Turkey in the Arab world failed. So the Arab Spring proved that Turkey has misperceived, miscalculated the Arab development. So this is, at the moment, there is a block against Turkey. What happens now in the Eastern Mediterranean is another debate. But the thing is, at the same time, that Turkey is one of the regional players, navigator, if you want, in the area that it has multilateral, multi-directional relations. So with a good and sound policy, Turkey indeed can contribute for the peace and stability. Interior Minister probably wanted to say this one.
Do we assume a post-Erdogan era anytime soon? I mean, we are talking about the next decade here. You are assuming a post-Erdogan era.
Everything is up to the God. If he wants to get him sooner as possible, we cannot do anything. But in theory, is the president until 2024. But the Turkish domestic politics is very dynamic at the moment. We have a lot of social and political and economic developments. I have some difficulties to see that he is elected for another term after 2024, but it will be very difficult 2020 for him in political terms.
It has been, thank you, sir, and we will get back to you. It has been a fascinating time for regional watchers as we have seen the rise once again, and let's remind ourselves that Russia has huge historical ties to this region, not least to Syria, but to have witnessed its experience in Syria is to have witnessed a re-emergence of a Russia across this region with questions now about what its strategy will be going forward in the next decade. Elena, the floor is yours for a couple of minutes.
Yeah, you are right. For example, Russia never been a colonial power here in the region, and as well not in Africa, never. On the contrary, the links between this region and Russia are very rich. But first of all, I will say that we should be optimistic. Not to repeat famous Thomas Gobb's quotation, the war of all against all, but to remember maybe other British philosopher, John Locke, who was saying, what a blessing to be born at time of storms. And the same one of Russian poets, Fyodor Tyutchev, he is quite same in Russia as well as Alexander Pushkin. So Fyodor Tyutchev was saying the same, what be blessing to be born at time of storms. In Arabic,
Which you mean what?
In Arabic, I need to say, Asa an takraha shay'an wa huwa khairun lakum, and Allah knows while you know not. So, despite all these challenges, we can combine our efforts to solve these problems. We Russians, we proposed to Americans in Syria to liberate Raqqa from terrorists together. Why it was refused? It was a strange decision, in our opinion, to refuse this proposal. And as I know, Turkey also proposed the same to Americans, and it was refused. Now what we see in this part of Syria, we see Turkish forces, Russian forces, and Syrian forces nearby from Raqqa. So what was the strange decision from American administration not to combine our efforts to do all this together? And we need to remember that no islands of stability will shelter from all these problems. The more slow economic growth, the threat of terrorism is existing, and the danger of conflict between Iran from one part and US and its allies also is growing. I have been in Syria recently, and I visited Palmyra, Damascus, the south of Idlib, other cities. Many of people asked me, not about big policy, but about opportunities, jobs. In Palmyra, they asked me, where are donors? Why the historical museum still destroyed? Why not to restore together, to rebuild together the great colony? So Russia is demanding now, is asking others to do it together. We propose this to Europeans, to Americans, to Chinese, to Gulf states, and I think it's quite possible.
Fascinating. All right, I want to talk to you both about where you see the Russian-Iranian relationship going forward, because I think we'd all agree that there is certainly a different sort of long-term strategy for those two countries in Syria. And Syria, of course, has provided the fulcrum, if you will, over this past decade for the conversation that we are having now, regional rivalries and influence. I just wonder whether, for example, we might discuss Libya as a potential fulcrum for the reconciliation or not of these relationships going forward as we see that develop. And you've already alluded to, Professor, the issue of Turkey's intent across the Mediterranean, and we also see Russian presence there. And I would like to discuss perhaps where you see Russia's strategy going forward. But before we do that, Dr. Sagar, you've listened to the perspective on Iran, Turkey, and Russia. Your perspective from the Saudi point of view, if you will.
Thank you very much, Becky. It's a pleasure to be back to Dubai in such an interesting forum. I think I'll start with Iran. Basically, there is a perception in the Iranian mind about two things in Saudi Arabia. One, the Saudi, they don't make their own decision, they just follow what the US want. And second, they have a permanent hatred on Shiism, because as the majority of Iranian are Shiism. There's a perception also in the Saudi mind that Iranian will never fulfill and deliver what they say. They will say something and then deliver something else. And that sort of perception of not trusting have been very difficult to build a confidence-build measure between both sides, to overcome many of the difficulties. At the same time, we listen to a lot of the promises, initiative in the region here, but let me say Saudi Arabia today, they are in a defensive position. They defend their country from a violent non-state actors that took over the power in Yemen. They started in September 2014, and Saudi have not made any military action except after 6 months from that sort of move. They went into Sana'a 23rd September, and Saudi by end of March 2015, then they start their military based on the request of the legitimate government. Our worries in Saudi Arabia, of course, if we legitimize a violent non-state actor's behavior, overtaking a power and throwing a legitimate government, where that will stop. So the question is, did we have the right, of course, to defend ourselves? Yes, we had the right to defend ourselves and to do whatever it takes to, protect the region. With the coalition of the UAE, Saudi Arabia have responded, according to their interests, with the regional interests also in that. If you look at the last attack on Aramco, of course, this raises many, many big questions there, of course. But at the same time, it shows that the strongest alliances that you have and the international treaty and agreement did not protect you from that one. So it means you have to go back, and I was pleased to see in the morning the talk about building capacity in the region and how that will be important for us. If I look at the Russian initiative, or if I look at the Iranian initiative, they don't talk about interventionist issues you see there. So that makes it a bit difficult. Looking at Turkey, for instance, Turkey used to have a much better relation with this part of the world. It changed when Turkey started to follow Iranian path, you see there, which is interfering in the different matter, trying to overplay, using ideology as a means to expand their spheres of influence on the region. Russia, of course, they have an initiative which is an interesting initiative. I don't think they are big enough or long enough. I wanted to summarize it, and it's only in one page. And if I summarize this initiative in one page about regional security, I think it's a premature one. It needs a lot of addressing of the issues, and it did not also talk about the interventionist dimension there. So, and overall, we do not like the non-Arab state interventionist policy in the region, being it Israel, Iran, Turkey. This is not acceptable. We find it, problem amongst Arab, countries could be resolved and can be resolved between them. We suffer a lot from the, external intervention on our field, being it in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, many of those areas, we suffer from that one. Can the international community really provide a solution that we're looking for? I kind of doubt it at this stage. What we need to revisit the whole security architecture of the region and look at. I mean, if you look at the Iranian initiative, for instance, it's based on two important pillars, according to Rouhani's speech in the UN Assembly. He said, non-intervention and non-aggression. This is what we have been suffering from, an Iranian intervention and aggression policy in the region. Today, if they have accepted these two principles, that they are going to base their initiative in that one, who will be the guarantor? How can we find a guarantor framework for such an initiative? And then, if there is a guarantor, how can we ensure sustainability? We don't want such an initiative to be as a result of the embargo has been imposed in Iran, and as a result of the domestic suffering that the Iranian government tried to find a way out by announcing an initiative they call it Hormuz Initiative, for the region here. This must come out of real belief and live in peace with the region. Prince Saud al-Faisal, the late Saud al-Faisal, said we need to have a friendly Iran and a safe Iraq and a prosperous Yemen. If we have that within the region, I'm sure we're going to see a much better region.
Okay, so what prospect of a friendly Iran, an Iran reconciled with other players in this region? We are, as you rightly pointed out, clearly entering a new era for the Islamic Republic as the regime struggles for legitimacy, and I think we can clearly say that there is a struggle for legitimacy at the moment. The forces taking over are loyal to the supreme leader. Moderates and reformers are being hung out to dry as hardliners get more power, not less. You have talked about the possibility of a militarized or a military dictatorship, a Putin-esque, forgive the phrase, Elena, environment going forward. I think you called it the emergence of a Persian Putin. Is there anything the US can do with its campaign of maximum pressure at present to avoid that and to create an environment whereby in the next decade there is some sort of reconciliation between Iran and, for example, Saudi and the rest of this Gulf region?
So the paradox of Iran is you have a regime whose worst elements resemble North Korea, and you have a society which aspires to be like South Korea. And I think the challenge for US strategy towards Iran is that to prevent Iran from becoming like North Korea has required political and economic isolation. But to help Iranian society become like South Korea requires political and economic engagement and reintegration. And so the US policy has been at loggerheads. The same policies that have been used to isolate the regime have also isolated the people. But Ibn Khaldun famously said that empires are built and destroyed over 3 generations. First generation builds it, second generation preserves it, third generation loses it. We're entering the second generation of leaders in Iran, as long as Ayatollah Khamenei is around, the organizing principle of the Islamic Republic is going to be opposition to the United States. But I think when you start to see the emergence of Revolutionary Guard figures, military figures in charge, I think it could portend a more pragmatic Iran, not a more moderate Iran, not a more democratic Iran, but a more pragmatic Iran that looks at national interests rather than revolutionary ideology.
The security forces are not monolithic in Iran. So is there an opportunity there to avoid the worst case scenario that this audience might perceive, which is an Iran which you simply will not be able to do business with going forward?
I mean, again, I think that the best US playbook for dealing with Iran was Ronald Reagan's playbook for dealing with the Soviet Union, which was, there was tactical dialogue, you had arms control talks with the Soviet Union, you had nuclear deals. At the same time, there was support and solidarity for civil society and the forces of change. And it requires a strategic patience because, you know, as we all know, it could be a decade or two before there's meaningful change in the country, and it's not something you can force over the course of a 2-year or 4-year administration.
Russian-Iranian relations have undergone quite the transformation as a result of the Russian intervention in the Syrian civil war, as have Russian-Turkish relations. And relations with Saudi Arabia, of course, through OPEC+, whether Saudi buys into this as a sort of long-term strategic relationship or whether it's just tactical at this time, we have seen an improvement. Many questions being asked, though, now, Elena, about Russia's influence in carving out a more stable Middle East in this next decade. Many suggesting that despite being able to sort of leverage this kind of diplomatic opportunity, being friends with everybody, including Israel, at this point, is there really any economic clout? Is there really much behind it? I wonder whether you might answer that question. And is this anything more than a Putin project rather than a national Russian project?
I feel it's rather a Russian national project, and Russia is coming back to this region, and we have a great economic interest to do this. We are now much more pragmatic than we were in the past. At the same time, we need to defend some principles like sovereignty of states, territorial integrity. In Syria, we are trying to preserve government institutions, and comparing to what happened in Iraq, I think it's very important. May I answer, may I try to answer the same question, Becky, you posed it to our friend, Karim, and what can the US do? In our opinion, at least, don't do it alone. Try to cooperate with others. We tried to monopolize the problem of Palestine without any success. We entered Iraq without a resolution of Security Council, without any success. Look at Iraq now. So combine your efforts with others. Cooperate with Russia. Cooperate with the European Union. This region is at the very heart of very important trade routes and corridors. So for China, for Russia, for Europe, it's strongly necessary to see this region stabilized. The question, is it the same importance for US to see it stabilized? We're not idealistic. Yes, we proposed some initiatives this summer. And it sounds maybe a little bit idealistic, but I'm sure that we can work on it. On 1968, the situation in Europe between Soviet Union and others was, it was the Cold War. But in 1969, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe was created. The same in Asia. In Asia, in 1960, the relationship between Singapore, Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia was very bad, but in 1962, Association of Southeast Asian States was created.
I understand. I get your point. Let me ask you this. I want to talk about where Turkey stands with regard Libya at present and whether it is doing anything but stoking regional tensions. But before we get to Turkey's position in Libya, what about Russia's intention? Because this is a short-term issue, and we're talking about a decade forward, but what Russia decides and how it plays out its influence in Libya could have a huge influence on what happens in the next decade. So just explain, if you will, what's going on.
First of all, in Russia, in Russian public opinion, Libya is an example how irresponsible some forces on international arena are. The regime was changed, but nobody took responsibility for reconstruction and for bringing new power, legitimate power there. And no NATO, no
With respect,
others.
you're sounding very altruistic here. It's like Russia's in it only for stability and security. I mean, let's be quite clear. There are
Not
there are
only, we
clearly
feel,
other
we, feel,
motives.
we feel that China needs the same. We feel that the European Union needs the same, but maybe not so strong to do it. And in Libya, we are talking to all forces, to Khalifa Haftar, to Sarraj, to people of Misurata. The principle is the same, to talk to all forces, the same as in the Middle East. We talk to Turks, to Israelis, to Iranians, to Arabs, and we could play the role of mediator. And we are playing this role.
Let's talk about the relationship between Russia and Saudi Arabia, Dr. Saga, if you will. I listened to Elena, and it sounds like there is a significant opportunity for Russia to play a very big role in this region in the next decade. But this is a country that, quite frankly, and perhaps you can talk about this through the Saudi perspective, lacks economic clout. I mean, why is it that Russia would play an outsized role in this region in the next decade? Where do you see?
Well, Russia had a long standing in the region and a special relation to various countries. If you look at today, Russia trade volume with the region, it's not significant. And mostly it is in military sales to countries like Algeria, to some other country like Iraq also, and perhaps Syria. While if you look at the Chinese trade relation in the Arab world, it goes beyond $170 billion. Russia is a producer of raw material like us. We both produce raw material. They have oil and gas, we have oil and gas. But at the same time, the only leverage they have is on the military side. And the military side, it's always been vetoed by the American, of course, friends and alliances in the region. For example, the S-400, they wanted to sell it to the region, but also it has a lot of objection. Turkey maybe have made a strong decision that they would like to go for the S-400. I'm not so sure some other country in the region would like to go for that one. Now, we have agreed in Saudi Arabia between Saudi and Russia to establish a fund of $10 billion basically to invest in Russia. There is a progress, but without the unfulfilled commitment of President Obama during his time, we would have never seen the repositioning of the Russian back into the region so aggressively like this. Now, they want to reposition themselves. Do they have the capacity? Do they have the ability as they used to in the old days of the Soviet Union? I think there are a lot of changes. If you look at today, Russia economic size is almost like the GDP, almost the size of Spain. So do they have an overcapacity that they can play? Can they really do that one? Or for us in the region, unfortunately, and I say it unfortunately, the only security guarantor we have at this stage is the US. They are the only one with a huge ability to deliver if it's needed, as it happened in 1990, and then with their invasion to Iraq in 2003. They do have the capability and the capacity to do. That's it. Russia, they do not have the capacity today to provide a security guarantor for us in the region. This is why we need to address the issue of a security architecture in the region. Who is in charge? What do we need? What is our local contribution? What is the external, or what I call import security solution to the region? How that is going to function? How do we perceive? I mean, from Iran point of view, Saudi Arabia is not the threat, it's the US. And the US and its alliances in the region, which mean Saudi Arabia, being one of them. This is how they perceive threat. For Saudi Arabia, the threat is Iran, interventionist policy and expansionist policy in the region, using sectarianism as a dimension for such an expansion there. So it's a different, again, equation there. Yes, I wish we will have a better relation with Russia, but we do not like to apply the same method, which they used to apply it before. Protecting somebody like Assad and keeping him in power under the so-called legitimate intervention by the Russian, allowing Turkey to interfere on the north side of Syria against the Kurdish. We're not supporting a separatist group, by the way. I think my argument on the North Syria and Northeast Syria, very simple. We need to have an international overlooking such a deporting of Syrian refugee from Syria, from Turkey to Syria. They need to be overlooked by a different structure and not by imposing, such a thing. We are not, by all means, because we suffer on the south border of Saudi Arabia by illegitimate, violent non-state actor, the Houthi. So we cannot support a separatist group on the north of Syria. That's a very important issue.
Let me, while I've got you, I just want to bring up one thing. As we move into 2020, do we expect to see an end to the dispute with Qatar, and how important will that be for Saudi going forward?
Well, it's up to them. I think the four states, that have taken the position against Qatar, they have a legitimate requirement. They have a legitimate reason, and it's up to Qatar if they want to be part of, the region. They cannot be isolated, of course, and they need to be part of the region. I think the leader of the Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and UAE, of course, have shown a certain flexibility if Qatar willing to change its position on the key issues. The key issue for us, Qatar being a member of the GCC, cannot play a role of destabilizing politically, security-wise in the region. So they need to be an inclusive and not as a pressure to support separatist group there.
We will see that story develop in the months to come. President Erdogan said recently, sir, a new era of peace and stability should be initiated in the Gulf region and the Middle East, urging Gulf countries to immediately end the sanctions on Qatar and restating Turkey's commitment to work towards peace. How important do you believe Turkey's continuing relations and negotiation, if you will, with Europe will be? Do we see a Turkey take its eyes off the West and move more east? And if that is the case, how does that reflect here? We've been talking about the possibility of a regional security initiative, a regional security force. How might Turkey play into that?
I think the Western relations, transatlantic relations, as well as the European relations, are safe haven for Turkish foreign policy. Turkey is very much disappointed by the Arab countries, and the Arab countries are disappointed by Turkey, so vice versa. But Turkey has good chemistry with Iran and Russia at the moment. Russia is our neighbor. Russia will stay there, and the Turkish-Russian relations will improve further in the long run. I do not see any crisis after 2015 shutdown of the plane. Putin plays chess. Tayyip Erdogan plays backgammon. It means Tayyip Erdogan is very lucky, always in his decisions, because the regional and global developments help him. But the fact is, at the end of the day, Turkey has 4 million people in Turkey as refugees. The Turkish presence in northern Syria is from the military point of view, is a great success. But Turkey was intending to have 440 kilometers line, but at the moment just 120 kilometers. So the main aim of Turkish operations or interventions. The Turks call always this type of military operations peace operations, by the way, whether it's in Cyprus or in northern Syria, always a peace operation. At the moment, the greatest concern for Turkey is what happens in the eastern part of Turkey, not in the west. The western countries, as we saw in London recently, Britain, France, and Germany, they will have a new type mechanism now to deal with Turkey. At least once in a year, they will come together and talk about it, because migration issue is not only Turkish issue, it is a European issue. So Turkey was securitizing this, and successful, I would say, in this sense. But the Arab countries should contribute for the future construction of Syria, and this new begin, maybe in the year 2020, Turkey and the Arab countries should sit down and talk once again what mistakes have been done, how we can correct this, and in the long run, work together.
Which takes me, with 4 and a bit minutes to go, to, I guess, a sort of closing statement from each of you. This has been absolutely fascinating. In the race for relevance and influence, can you envision reconciliation amongst parties across this region and opportunities for this next decade through the prism of Iran? What chance?
Well, I think the most incisive comment that's been made about Iran over the last 2 decades comes from Henry Kissinger. He said that Iran has to decide whether it's a nation or a cause. And I think if you start to see a leadership in Iran, not now, but over the next decade, that prioritizes national interest before revolutionary ideology, then it doesn't make sense for Iran to be constantly fighting with Saudi Arabia and with Israel or with the United States. That said, I also think the Russian-Iranian alliance is an historic aberration. The fact that Russia and Iran are allies and Russia and America and Iran are adversaries doesn't make any sense in the context of Iranian national interests. So I would see...
Despite them being neighbors, of course. But
despite them being neighbors, Russia really has nothing to offer Iran or the Middle East aside from cheap weapons. No one wants to study in Russia. No one wants to send their kids to study in Russia or have economic relations with them. So I think Russia's current presence in the Middle East is an historic aberration. There's power vacuums throughout the region that are being filled, but that will likely evolve by 2030.
No, fascinating. Elena?
I'm sure that we need to find solutions for many problems in the Middle East, and don't forget also Palestinian problem. It's still very important, and the main issue now is to escape the 1914 moment in relationship between Iran and the others. I mean, on the eve of the First World War, 1914. And Russia is ready to mediate between Iran and others. And also we need to find a reasonable solution for Syrian conflict. There is a Turkish political analyst, Ibrahim Karagul, who wrote that Syria is like microcosm, like mirror for all international problems. If we will find the solution together, we will find solutions for other problems as well. If not, the tensions will still grow.
Then that's certainly an opportunity that this region would like to see. We know it is complicated and fractured. The race for relevance and influence, is there an opportunity to reconcile rather than have these sort of divergent and conflicting positions amongst the 4 powers that we've been discussing today as we move into the next decade? And if not, what impact?
Well, basically, we need to live in peace in the region here. We do not wish to see this external intervention using military or sectarian dimension or any other dimension in interfering in our Arab affairs. We were happier without that sort of intervention, and I think we can still manage the future without that external intervention. If we focus on the economic development and in a much better relation, that will bring us a better, I'm sure Iran can take many positive initiatives, including free zone of WMD. That one will be, working in a confidence build measure, not only by talking about it, but really implementing the necessary step, whether it's from Turkey or from Iran, and also from our Russian friend. They cannot have a double standard procedures like what the American have. If they would like, they need to be an honest broker. If they would like to be a broker accepted in the region here, their brokerage in the Arab-Israeli conflict have not been, as honest as they should be there, in really brokering the Arab-Israeli conflict the way how we expected. But again, sometimes there are issues beyond their control. I will count more on the people of the region, building their own region, focusing on their own region, devoting time, getting more Gulf unity, in working together.
Sure.
We respect every country independency and also their own, sovereign issues, which is, of course, related to each state. But at the same time, we have a regional interest can bring a much more stability.
And you bring up a very good point, and it's something we should have discussed, but my clock says time out, and I'm going to give you the last word, Professor. But I do wonder how each of us might feel about the people versus power protests and how influential and relevant we believe the people of this region will be in the next decade. Mass discontent with the political, economic and social sort of status quo. A shared ideology across the region, beginning to see that, but no organized leadership. So we are seeing more of a civil rights situation rather than a revolution, and I wonder whether there is a viable alternative. But sir, we didn't get to that. I know it's important. This has been fascinating. Last word to you, sir.
It's like Turkish foreign policy. Time is out, but we have extension. It means
Not long, though.
During this extension period, Turkey can score. It means for the long run, the Middle East remains for Turkey as an inevitable region where Turkey should be in, but the question of relevance is question mark, because Turkey has to restore trust. Turkey has to restore confidence, and Turkey has to be much more reliable, not having great ideas like neo-Ottoman policies which shaped in the last 10 years in the entire intellectual debate. Turkey should be a democratic, open, transparent society, showing the way to Muslim countries that Islam and democracy can function. This is the biggest contribution of Turkey during this extension period. Thank you.
Should be, could be, will it be? Thank you for that as the last line and the last word on what has been a fascinating panel. Thank you so much to all of you.